Swann's Way, Overture, Part 2. My sole consolation when I went upstairs for the night was that Mamma would come in and kiss me after I was in bed. But this good night lasted for so short a time. She went down again so soon that the moment in which I heard her climb the stairs, and then caught the sound of her garden dress of blue muslin, from which hung little tassels of plaited straw rustling along the double-doored corridor, was for me a moment of the keenest sorrow. So much did I love that good night that I reached the stage of hoping that it would come as late as possible, so as to prolong the time of respite during which Mamma would not yet have appeared. Sometimes, when, after kissing me, she opened the door to go, I longed to call her back, to say to her, "Kiss me just once again." But I knew that then she would at once look displeased, for the concession which she made to my wretchedness and agitation in coming up to me with this kiss of peace always annoyed my father, who thought such ceremonies absurd, and she would have liked to try to induce me to outgrow the custom of having her there at all, which was a very different thing from letting the custom grow up of my asking her for an additional kiss when she was already crossing the threshold. And to see her look displeased destroyed all the sense of tranquillity she had brought me the moment before, when she bent her loving face down over my bed and held it out to me like a host, for an act of communion in which my lips might drink deeply the sense of her real presence, and with it the power to sleep. But those evenings on which Mamma stayed so short a time in my room were sweet indeed, compared to those on which we had guests to dinner, and therefore she did not come at all. Our guests were practically limited to Monsieur Swann, who, apart from a few passing strangers, was almost the only person who ever came to the house at Combray, sometimes to a neighborly dinner, but less frequently since his unfortunate marriage, as my family did not care to receive his wife, and sometimes after dinner uninvited. On those evenings when, as we sat in front of the house beneath the big chestnut tree and round the iron table, we heard from the far end of the garden, not the large and noisy rattle which heralded and deafened as he approached with its ferruginous, interminable, frozen sound, any member of the household who would put it out of action by coming in without ringing, but the double peal, timid, oval, gilded, of the visitor's bell. Everyone would at once exclaim, "A visitor! Who in the world can it be?" But they knew quite well that it could only be Monsieur Swann. My great aunt, speaking in a loud voice to set an example, in a tone which she endeavored to make sound natural, would tell the others not to whisper so, that nothing could be more unpleasant for a stranger coming in, who would be led to think that people were saying things about him which he was not meant to hear. And then my grandmother would be sent out as a scout, always happy to find an excuse for an additional turn in the garden, which she would utilize to remove surreptitiously, as she passed, the stakes of a rose tree or two, so as to make the roses look a little more natural, as a mother might run her hand through her boy's hair after the barber had smoothed it down to make it stick out properly round his head. And there we would all stay, hanging on the words which would fall from my grandmother's lips when she brought us back her report of the enemy, as though there had been some uncertainty among a vast number of possible invaders. And then, soon after, my grandfather would say, "I can hear Swann's voice." And indeed, one could tell him only by his voice, for it was difficult to make out his face, with its arched nose and green eyes, under a high forehead fringed with fair, almost red hair, dressed in the Bresson style, because in the garden we used as little light as possible so as not to attract mosquitoes, and I would slip away as though not going for anything in particular, to tell them to bring out the syrups, for my grandmother made a great point, thinking it nicer of their not being allowed to seem anything out of the ordinary, which we kept for visitors only. Although a far younger man, Monsieur Swann was very much attached to my grandfather, who had been an intimate friend, in his time, of Swann's father, an excellent but an eccentric man in whom the least little thing would, it seemed, often check the flow of his spirits and divert the current of his thoughts. Several times in the course of a year I would hear my grandfather tell at table the story, which never varied, of the behavior of Monsieur Swann the elder upon the death of his wife, by whose bedside he had watched day and night. My grandfather, who had not seen him for a long time, hastened to join him at the Swann's family property on the outskirts of Cambrai, and managed to entice him for a moment, weeping profusely, out of the death chamber, so that he should not be present when the body was laid in its coffin. They took a turn or two in the park, where there was a little sunshine. Suddenly Monsieur Swann seized my grandfather by the arm and cried, "Oh, my dear old friend, how fortunate we are to be walking here together on such a charming day! Don't you see how pretty they are, all these trees, my hawthorns, and my new pond on which you have never congratulated me? You look as glum as a nightcap. Don't you feel this little breeze? Ah, whatever you may say, it's good to be alive all the same, my dear Amédée." And then, abruptly, the memory of his dead wife returned to him, and probably thinking it too complicated to inquire into how, at such a time, he could have allowed himself to be carried away by an impulse of happiness, he confined himself to a gesture which he habitually employed whenever any perplexing question came into his mind. That is, he passed his hand across his forehead, dried his eyes, and wiped his glasses. And he could never be consoled for the loss of his wife, but used to say to my grandfather, during the 2 years for which he survived her, "It's a funny thing now. I very often think of my poor wife, but I cannot think of her very much at any one time. Often, but a little at a time, like poor old Swann," became one of my grandfather's favorite phrases, which he would apply to all kinds of things, and I should have assumed that this father of Swann's had been a monster if my grandfather, whom I regarded as a better judge than myself, and whose word was my law, and often led me in the long run to pardon offences which I should have been inclined to condemn, had not gone on to exclaim, "But, after all, he had a heart of gold." For many years, albeit, and especially before his marriage, Monsieur Swann the younger came often to see them at Cambrai. My great aunt and grandparents never suspected that he had entirely ceased to live in the kind of society which his family had frequented, or that, under the sort of incognito which the name of Swann gave him among us, they were harboring, with the complete innocence of a family of honest innkeepers who have in their midst some distinguished highwayman and never know it. They were harboring one of the smartest members of the Jockey Club, a particular friend of the Comte du Paris and of the Prince of Wales, and one of the men most sought after in the aristocratic world of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Our utter ignorance of the brilliant part which Swann was playing in the world of fashion was, of course, due in part to his own reserve and discretion, but also to the fact that middle-class people in those days took what was almost a Hindu view of society, which they held to consist of sharply defined castes, so that everyone at his birth found himself called to that station in life which his parents already occupied, and nothing except the chance of a brilliant career or of a good marriage could extract you from that station or admit you to a superior caste. Monsieur Swann, the father, had been a stockbroker, and so young Swann found himself immured for life in a caste where one's fortune, as in a list of taxpayers, varied between such and such limits of income. We knew the people with whom his father had associated, and so we knew his own associates, the people with whom he was in a position to mix. If he knew other people besides, those were youthful acquaintances on whom the old friends of the family, like my relatives, shut their eyes all the more good-naturedly that Swann himself, after he was left an orphan, still came most faithfully to see us. But we would have been ready to wager that the people outside our acquaintance whom Swann knew were of the sort to whom he would not have dared to raise his hat had he met them while he was walking with ourselves. Had there been such a thing as a determination to apply to Swann a social coefficient peculiar to himself, as distinct from all the other sons of other stockbrokers in his father's position, his coefficient would have been rather lower than theirs, because, leading a very simple life, and having always had a craze for antiques and pictures, he now lived and piled up his collections in an old house which my grandmother longed to visit, but which stood on the Quai d'Orléans, a neighborhood in which my great-aunt thought it most degrading to be quartered. "Are you really a connoisseur now?" she would say to him. "I ask for your own sake, as you are likely to have fakes palmed off on you by the dealers." For she did not, in fact, endow him with any critical faculty, and had no great opinion of the intelligence of a man who, in conversation, would avoid serious topics, and showed a very dull preciseness, not only when he gave us kitchen recipes, going into the most minute details, but even when my grandmother's sisters were talking to him about art. When challenged by them to give an opinion or to express his admiration for some picture, he would remain almost impolitely silent, and would then make amends by furnishing, if he could, some fact or other about the gallery in which the picture was hung, or the date at which it had been painted. But as a rule he would content himself with trying to amuse us by telling us the story of his latest adventure, and he would have a fresh story for us on every occasion, with someone whom we ourselves knew, such as the Combray chemist, or our cook, or our coachman. These stories certainly used to make my great-aunt laugh, but she could never tell whether that was on account of the absurd parts which Swann invariably made himself play in the adventures, or of the wit that he showed in telling us of them. "It is easy to see that you are a regular character, Monsieur Swann." As she was the only member of our family who could be described as a trifle common, she would always take care to remark to strangers, when Swann was mentioned, that he could easily, if he had wished to, have lived in the Boulevard Haussmann, or the Avenue de l'Opéra, and that he was the son of old Monsieur Swann, who must have left 4 or 5 million francs, but that it was a fad of his. A fad which, moreover, she thought was bound to amuse other people so much that in Paris, when Monsieur Swann called on New Year's Day, bringing her a little packet of marron glacé, she never failed, if there were strangers in the room, to say to him, "Well, Monsieur Swann, And do you still live next door to the bonded vaults, so as to be sure of not missing your train when you go to Lyons? And she would peep out of the corner of her eye over her glasses at the other visitors. But if anyone had suggested to my aunt that this Swann, who in his capacity as the son of old Monsieur Swann was fully qualified to be received by any of the upper middle class, the most respected barristers and solicitors of Paris, though he was perhaps a trifle inclined to let this hereditary privilege go into abeyance, had another, almost secret existence of a wholly different kind, that when he left our house in Paris, saying that he must go home to bed, he would no sooner have turned the corner than he would stop, retrace his steps, and be off to some drawing-room on whose like no stockbroker or associate of stockbrokers had ever set eyes, that would have seemed to my aunt as extraordinary as, to a woman of wider reading, the thought of being herself on terms of intimacy with Aristaeus, of knowing that he would, when he had finished his conversation with her, plunge deep into the realms of Thetis, into an empire veiled from mortal eyes, in which Virgil depicts him as being received with open arms, or to be content with an image more likely to have occurred to her, for she had seen it painted on the plates we used for biscuits at Cambrai, as the thought of having had to dinner Ali Baba, who, as soon as he found himself alone and unobserved, would make his way into the cave, resplendent with its unsuspected treasures. One day, when he had come to see us after dinner in Paris, and had begged pardon for being in evening clothes, Françoise, when he had gone, told us that she had got it from his coachman that he had been dining with a princess. A pretty sort of princess, drawled my aunt. I know them, and she shrugged her shoulders without raising her eyes from her knitting, serenely ironical. Altogether, my aunt used to treat him with scant ceremony, since she was of the opinion that he ought to feel flattered by our invitations. She thought it only right and proper that he should never come to see us in summer without a basket of peaches or raspberries from his garden, and that from each of his visits to Italy he should bring back some photographs of old masters for me. It seemed quite natural, therefore, to send to him whenever we wanted a recipe for some special sauce, or for a pineapple salad for one of our big dinner parties, to which he himself would not be invited, not seeming of sufficient importance to be served up to new friends who might be in our house for the first time. If the conversation turned upon the princes of the house of France, "Gentlemen, you and I will never know, will we? And we don't want to, do we?" my great aunt would say tartly to Swann, who had perhaps a letter from Twickenham in his pocket. She would make him play accompaniments and turn over music on evenings when my grandmother's sister sang, manipulating this creature, so rare and refined at other times and in other places, with the rough simplicity of a child who will play with some curio from the cabinet no more carefully than if it were a penny toy. Certainly the Swann, who was a familiar figure in all the clubs of those days, differed hugely from the Swann created in my great aunt's mind, when, of an evening in our little garden at Cambrai, after the two shy peals had sounded from the gate, she would vitalize by injecting into it everything she had ever heard about the Swann family, the vague and unrecognizable shape which began to appear, with my grandmother in its wake, against a background of shadows, and could at last be identified by the sound of its voice. But then, even in the most insignificant details of our daily life, none of us can be said to constitute a material whole, which is identical for every one, and need only be turned up like a page in an account book or the record of a will. Our social personality is created by the thoughts of other people. Even the simple act which we describe as seeing someone we know is, to some extent, an intellectual process. We pack the physical outline of the creature we see with all the ideas we have already formed about him, and in the complete picture of him which we compose in our minds, those ideas have certainly the principal place. In the end they come to fill out so completely the curves of his cheeks, to follow so exactly the line of his nose, they blend so harmoniously in the sound of his voice, that these seem to be no more than a transparent envelope, so that each time we see the face or hear the voice it is our own ideas of him which we recognize, and to which we listen. And so, no doubt, from the Swann they had built up for their own purposes, my family had left out, in their ignorance, a whole crowd of the details of his daily life in the world of fashion, details by means of which other people, when they met him, saw all the graces enthroned in his face, and stopping at the line of his arched nose as at a natural frontier. But they contrived also to put into a face from which its distinction had been evicted, a face vacant and roomy as an untenanted house, to plant in the depths of its unvalued eyes a lingering sense, uncertain but not unpleasing, half memory and half oblivion, of idle hours spent together after our weekly dinners round the card table or in the garden during our companionable country life. Our friend's bodily frame had been so well lined with this sense, and with various earlier memories of his family, that their own special Swann had become to my people a complete and living creature, so that even now I have the feeling of leaving someone I know for another quite different person, when, going back in memory, I pass from the Swann whom I knew later and more intimately to this early Swann in whom I can distinguish the charming mistakes of my childhood, and who, incidentally, is less like his successor than he is like the other people I knew at that time, as though one's life were a series of galleries in which all the portraits of any one period had a marked family likeness, the same, so to speak, tonality. This early Swann abounding in leisure, fragrant with the scent of the great chestnut tree, of baskets of raspberries, and of a sprig of tarragon. And yet, one day, when my grandmother had gone to ask some favour of a lady whom she had known at the Sacré-Cœur, and with whom, because of our caste theory, she had not cared to keep up any degree of intimacy in spite of several common interests, the Marquise de Villeparisis of the famous house of Bouillon, this lady had said to her, "I think you know Monsieur Swann very well. He is a great friend of my nephew's, the de Lens." My grandmother had returned from the call full of praise for the house, which overlooked some gardens, and in which Madame de Villeparisis had advised her to rent a flat, and also for a repairing tailor and his daughter, who kept a little shop in the courtyard, into which she had gone to ask them to put a stitch in her skirt, which she had torn on the staircase. My grandmother had found these people perfectly charming. The girl, she said, was a jewel, and the tailor a most distinguished man, the finest she had ever seen. For in her eyes distinction was a thing wholly independent of social position. She was in ecstasies over some answer the tailor had made, saying to Mamma, "Savine would not have said it better." And by way of contrast of a nephew of Madame de Villeparisis whom she had met at the house, "My dear, he is so common." Now, The effect of that remark about Swann had been, not to raise him in my great aunt's estimation, but to lower Madame de Villeparisis. It appeared that the deference which, on my grandmother's authority, we owed to Madame de Villeparisis imposed on her the reciprocal obligation to do nothing that would render her less worthy of our regard, and that she had failed in her duty in becoming aware of Swann's existence and in allowing members of her family to associate with him. How should she know Swann, a lady who, you always made out, was related to Marshal MacMahon? This view of Swann's social atmosphere, which prevailed in my family, seemed to be confirmed later on by his marriage with a woman of the worst class, you might almost say a fast woman, whom, to do him justice, he never attempted to introduce to us, for he continued to come to us alone, though he came more and more seldom, but from whom they thought they could establish, on the assumption that he found her there, the circle, unknown to them, in which he ordinarily moved. But on one occasion my grandfather read in a newspaper that Monsieur Swann was one of the most faithful attendants at the Sunday luncheons given by the Duc d'Aix, whose father and uncle had been among our most prominent statesmen in the reign of Louis Philippe. Now my grandfather was curious to learn all the little details which might help him to take a mental share in the private lives of men like Molé, the Duc Pasquier, or the Duc de Broglie. He was delighted to find that Swann associated with people who had known them. My great aunt, however, interpreted this piece of news in a sense discreditable to Swann, for anyone who chose his associates outside the caste in which he had been born and bred, outside his proper station, was condemned to utter degradation in her eyes. It seemed to her that such a one abdicated all claim to enjoy the fruits of those friendly relations with people of good position which prudent parents cultivate and store up for their children's benefit. For my great aunt had actually ceased to see the son of a lawyer we had known, because he had married a highness, and had thereby stepped down, in her eyes, from the respectable position of a lawyer's son to that of those adventurers, upstart footmen or stable boys mostly, to whom we read that queens have sometimes shown their favours. She objected, therefore, to my grandfather's plan of questioning Swann, when next he came to dine with us, about these people whose friendship with him we had discovered. On the other hand, my grandmother's two sisters, elderly spinsters who shared her nobility of character but lacked her intelligence, declared that they could not conceive what pleasures their brother-in-law could find in talking about such trifles. They were ladies of lofty ambition, who for that reason were incapable of taking the least interest in what might be called the pinchbeck things of life, even when they had an historic value, or, generally speaking, in anything that was not directly associated with some object aesthetically precious. So complete was their negation of interest in anything which seemed directly or indirectly a part of our everyday life, that their sense of hearing, which had gradually come to understand its own futility when the tone of the conversation at the dinner-table became frivolous or merely mundane, without the two old ladies being able to guide it back to a topic dear to themselves, their sense of hearing would leave its receptive channels unemployed so effectively that they were actually becoming atrophied. So that, if my grandfather wished to attract the attention of the two sisters, he would have to make use of some such alarm signals as mad doctors adopt in dealing with their distracted patients, as by beating several times on a glass with the blade of a knife, fixing them at the same time with a sharp word and a compelling glance, violent methods which the said doctors are apt to bring with them into their everyday life among the sane, either from force of professional habit, or because they think the whole world a trifle mad.